Hello everyone. As Karen said, I'm Jody. Thank you for having me here today. Thank you to the Hismic Trust and who you guys can't see, Liz is doing all the functioning technical bits back here, and I'm so grateful for that because I'm not very technical at all. Now, I'm still trying to get used to Zoom, even though we've now been using it for quite a while, but I'll just explain a little about me in the fact that what you can't see is that I'm actually totally blind. So I have a lived experience of disability, and down alongside of me is my guide dog Xanthi, who is fast asleep. It didn't take her too long to get into that position. To have a dog's life. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about accessible access and inclusion. Now, access and inclusion are actually two different things. Some people think they're actually one of the same, but they're not. Access basically means that someone with a disability or even without a classified disability can come to your event and physically access it. So whether there's ramps, good footpaths, widened doorways, accessible bathrooms, all that sort of stuff. So that's what access means. Inclusion is something completely different. So you may have an accessible space, but you're not welcoming and you're not inclusive. So inclusion is more about probably your attitude. And I have this phrase of late that inclusivity means you're accessible, but access doesn't usually mean you're inclusive. So being inclusive basically means that you're seeing everybody for who they are. So, you know, I for example, I have a disability. You would come up to me, introduce yourself, and ask, or even direct me, tell me what is around, etc. And you know, that means I feel welcome. I can come to your event. I can participate in what you're doing and what you're actually, you know, displaying. What stories you might be telling, and you know, it is a welcoming space. So, you know, access and inclusion isn't always just for people who have a disability. Ultimately, that's what the catchphrase is designed for. But if you're accessible and inclusive, you're actually your space is welcoming, not for just people who have disabilities, for people who have other types of requirements, like people who are elderly. They often have some mobility requirements, may have some hearing or visual difficulties. And for parents that may have prams, so, you know, getting around, making sure that you have a space or an entrance for people who have prams. It's very quite often that, you know, someone who's in a wheelchair will go to an event and can't get in because there's stairs. It's pretty much the same principle if a parent arrives with a pram, especially if it's quite, I guess, quite a bulky pram that they couldn't just lift up the stairs. So if you are accessible inclusive, you're open and welcoming to everybody. I'm just going to use the phrase inclusion from here on in, because if you're inclusive, you're accessible. So what sort of events would you think you'd be inclusive for? The short answer to that is all of them. So, you know, things like conferences, exhibitions, awards nights, ceremonies, fundraisers, seminars, etc. The list is exhaustive. So sometimes what's best to know is to go back to the ground roots and learn a little about, you know, what is behind disability and the thought patterns. So there is something for, and I apologise for people who do know about this, so I won't extensively go on, but the social model of disability, that's the model of disability of which we refer to today. So older models have been the moral model, and that is very hard to say fast, the charitable model, and the medical model. And those in themselves can't quite explanatory. The social model is a little bit different in the way that it comes across. It distinguishes the difference between impairment and disability. So society poses the disability. The person, like myself, has an impairment. So for example, blindness, or what caused my blindness is my impairment. But for some reason, if I couldn't get directions on the street because I couldn't see the street sign, that is considered a disability. So, and that is what society poses on people. So that's the thoughts behind the social model of disability. It was actually developed in the United Kingdom in the late 70s. So it's sort of been around for quite a while, but it's only really this century that it started to actually play in, and definitely play in here in Australia. There are some differences between the United Kingdom and Australia where the social model is concerned. Most of them are around language. So because society poses the disability, the UK uses disability first language. So in the United Kingdom, I would be a blind person. Here in Australia, while there are some people that do subscribe to that disability first language, the majority of people subscribe to person first language. So in that way, it means I'm a person who is blind. And that's about being, you are a person before you anything else. And, your disability is just part of your makeup, and it should be taken as that. And I always say to people who are a little unsure about disability, they're afraid of saying the wrong thing, they're afraid of doing the wrong thing. If you actually see the person before you see the disability, and treat the person as a person, and don't react to the disability. So for example, you would go up, you would speak to them, hello, you perhaps introduce yourself, especially if you didn't have a name badge or you were talking to someone blind or vision impaired. Or if you were talking to someone who was deaf or hard of hearing, you may point to your name badge so that they're able to know who you are. And you would actually ask them their requirements or how you can assist them, rather than assuming what they want and doing it for them. So it's all about the person and the person's requirements and decisions and choices that they wish to make. So that's what's pretty much behind the thought patterns of the social model of disability. Now, when you're looking at doing an event and making that inclusive, the best place to start thinking about that is if you're actually applying for grants or doing the budgeting, that's where you need to think about it. Because while there are some low cost solutions to inclusive measures, there are sometimes, depending on the venue that you're providing them in, there can be some slightly more exorbitant costs. So you would do it at the actual planning stages rather than at the end where you're retrofitting it into your program. That becomes rather expensive. If you have a dedicated person to oversee access, that person can actually get across the board with it and can be communicating with everyone and everyone's aspect that they're in charge of. So, and they will have lots of different advice and possibly different solutions to what you may be able to provide, opposed to having to dig deep into a purse that doesn't exist. And they also can plan out when things need to be implemented. So, for example, if and I know you guys are not doing buildings, but if you were sort of looking at buildings, you would make sure that things like ramps and corridor widths is all implemented all in that planning stages, and they would need to be put in at the appropriate time of a building. But very fortunately for you guys, you're not building. But some of the things that you will need to think about when you're setting up your event is sort of things around, if you've got tables, the width between the tables, to make sure that it's at least 130 centimetres or 100 millimetres wide. So that allows basically 2 people to get through. So if someone is in a wheelchair, and depending on the size of the wheelchair, that can move through smoothly. If somebody has an assistant with them, they can go side by side. Even people who have assistance animals, they also can go side by side. So things like and tables, you'd want to make sure that while not everything has to be low, it's at a height where people who are in wheelchairs can actually see what's on your table, and also little people. So they can actually be a part and see the materials, the objects, and everything that you also have on display, because if they're there, they obviously want to know more. So you'd also look at your venues, entries and exits, and that's where you need to make sure that you have adequate things like ramps and door widths and everything. You know, you might be looking for an event to hire, and you may think, well, okay, I wish to make sure that, you know, the doors are wide enough for people in, you know, mobility devices can actually come through, and, you know, because I want these people here just with everybody else. So you'd also make sure that your emergency exits in the buildings that you're with are also accessible. The last thing you would want is for someone with a disability to actually feel trapped. Sometimes, you know, if you're in a building and you're on a first, second, third or upwards floor, you may think, well, how do I do that? There are measures in place where you would have I would hope you would have a fire exit, and what would happen is people with mobility devices or who are unable to find their own way out would actually just go in and stand in that stairwell platform and wait for emergency services to come and assist them, or for someone to come and assist them of the building. So buildings will have those methods in place. If you're having, you know, refreshments, you need to ensure that, again, appropriate heights for your refreshment tables. And if you're handing out, someone is going around handing out refreshments, that, you know, for someone who is, say, a little person and may only be, say, 3 foot tall, doesn't have to reach 5 or 6 foot high just to get a refreshment that someone may be holding out. That doesn't mean you need to walk around with everything at 2 foot high. It just means if you see these people, just discreetly lower your tray and offer without standing there and telling them what they may want. It's a very big thing that in the past, particularly under the charity model, is that people actually tell you, or tell people with disabilities, what they want, what they need, and what they want to do. That time is now past, which is fantastic for everybody. So you just need to avoid that. And the thought doesn't have to be yours. All you need to do is provide it so someone can, you know, who has additional requirements can actually access it. So there, and that way you are being inclusive in what you're doing. Bathroom access is another issue that a lot of people come across is that often accessible bathrooms are used as storage facilities. So if you're in a building that has an accessible bathroom and that is being used as a storage facility, you may like to highlight that to the person and tell them why they actually need to not use that as a storage facility. And that is because that someone cannot use bathroom facilities if the bathroom is blocked full of different items. Other things you may want to consider are things like sound, lighting, and visuals. So obviously you have your varying disabilities. So you'll have from people who are deaf to across to people who are blind, and you think, well, what do I do there? So you need to make sure your sound system or your speech is quite clear. That doesn't mean you have to enunciate everything very clearly and slowly. That doesn't work very well. So you would just make sure that your speech was clear, you were speaking in a modulated voice and open about what you were saying. Some people who are deaf can actually lip read, and that's why you need to be quite clear in how you're speaking and not exaggerate what you're saying. Sound systems, if you have sound systems, they really need to be clear of sound. If you have a soundtrack to something that you're presenting, often people who are hard of hearing or even deaf can actually put their hands on the speakers and they can feel the vibration pattern, and that can be quite stimulating in enhancing their enjoyment of the actual exhibition or event that you're holding. When you get to lighting, try and avoid things like strobe lighting, because that can cause epileptic fits in a lot of people, and some other types of issues as well. So you just want to make sure that your lighting was bright, not glary bright, but bright so people can easily see through, so it's not dark and dingy. If you were showing a film or demonstrating something that needed dimmed light, you would just make that particular area dimmed and then raise the lighting after. With visuals, you'd need to make them, and this goes with your marketing as well, is that you need to make them clear, and you need to also make them at a height that's acceptable for everybody. So again, if someone is 3 foot tall or sitting down, and you had some signage at 6 or 7 foot high, that's extremely hard for them to see it. It also causes sometimes a bit of a neck ache for people. But again, if you had someone who was 6'4", you wouldn't want to put your signage at 2 foot high. So around $1.50 m is a really good place to put your signage. Sometimes you may want to put it slightly higher depending on what particular type of signage you have. But it does need to be clear. So when you're doing your signage, particular signage is don't put writing over pictures. It's really hard to distinguish what is actually written there if it's actually overwriting, and that's because of the colour patterns that distorts with the actual print. The other thing is not to use block capitals for your whole word. Again, that's because people, when they read, sometimes they read by the actual pattern of the letters. So, with your Y's that go down, Y's and G's that, go down below a line, and your L's and T's that may go higher than a line, they actually follow those patterns of the letters to read it. Whereas if it's in block capitals, it's very much sort of like a rectangle and hard to distinguish what it actually says. So your signage does need to be really clear It doesn't have to be boring. You can put pictures on your signage, just not where your words are. So you may like to have a picture and then use some words and a picture underneath, just not overlaid. And that's also very much with your marketing as well, your marketing materials. People think, oh, that's boring, but I have come across some very effective marketing where print is not overlaid over pictures. The other thing too is that people who have dementia, depending on the colour scheme, that can actually affect them quite dramatically, particularly if your colour scheme is quite gaudy. Or what we would probably consider to be gaudy and stark. So, and you don't want people to feel uncomfortable. If you're giving some kind of lecture, you would need to ensure that you have some seating. If it's a stand-up lecture, you would need to ensure that you do have seating for some people who actually are unable to stand for long periods of time. If it is a sit-down type lecture, you'd need to make sure that you had spaces for assistance animals and wheelchairs, and not just in one spot, like don't just pop them at the back and forget them. That's, it happens quite frequently, and quite ironically, last year before COVID, I was at an Access conference in Sydney, and this was a conference of Access consultants who put 2 lower tables at the back of the room, stuck wheelchair signs on them, and that's where the people with wheelchairs sat. They weren't able to sit anywhere else because the tables were so close together they weren't able to manoeuvre through them. And this was an Access conference, so it was pretty degrading, we thought, in the manner that they did that. So try and avoid doing that. That doesn't mean that the middle of the room between all the tables is the best place, because it's probably not. But try not to segregate dramatically and obviously people from each other. You'd want to make sure that there was good parking around if you're looking, so good disability parking, not only just for disability parking, but for people who had mobility issues where they weren't able to walk long distances, that the parking was quite close, or maybe you arrange some kind of welcome wagon to assist those people to get to where they're going. Another thing you might want to look at, sorry, I've just lost my place. Staff training or volunteer training. So you might want to provide some disability awareness training for them. There are organisations that provide that. And, they talk to them about disability, what it is, the best way to approach it. Because some people have never encountered anyone with a disability, and they're not sure because they just don't know, not because they want to discriminate or not because they think people are lower than them. Often it's just because they just don't know. Other things around language, particularly with deaf and hard of hearing people, is Auslan and captioning. Now, obviously, a lot of people would have heard of Auslan and captioning. The thing to note is that people who speak Auslan don't often read as well as people who do not. Auslan is actually considered a second language, or for some a first language, and English is their second language. So, and the deaf sector, particularly people who are deaf from birth, who do learn Auslan, that's their main language. So everything is interpreted from English into Auslan. So it's, while, maybe having captioning is a really good option, it's, don't think that that's a one-stop shop fix for everything. Obviously, if budgets are tight, it's your better option because you can cover both sectors, in the fact that people who are hard of hearing and are deaf will be able to access it, but it's not the preferred way, particularly for people who are deaf. The other thing you could do is ensure that the venue, if you're hiring space in a venue, they're aware that they may have service animals coming in, and that it's acceptable by law that service animals can come into the building. Around captioning, there are some people who, if you're having, again, say a lecture or a talk, there are people who can come along and type into a typewriter, a special typewriter, and captioning comes straight up. So it's a live captioning service. The other thing too is that with Auslan, you can have an Auslan interpreter there. They stand just to the side on the stage and interpret everything that you're saying to the audience, and they're in a clear space for all the audience to see. And it doesn't matter then where the deaf person is sitting, they can access it just like everyone else, and it doesn't actually hinder your talk at all. If you're having guest speakers and asking people to speak, make sure you have different heights or adjustable microphones. So obviously everyone, no one is the same height. So you may have some person who's 6 foot and your next person is a little person at 3 foot. So you need to have something that you are able to adjust. Sorry, I should have finished off on captioning. I just jumped there. With digital content, there are some digital contents that actually have a captioning option, and it will caption it for you. However, this is done by artificial intelligence, and I don't know if anyone's ever, dictated into their mobile phone. Is sometimes it doesn't always say or dictate correctly what you're saying. I know that I do that because it's quicker than me typing it in, and I've sent some very strange messages, and people have come back to me and said, "What on earth are you talking about?" So just be aware that while those options are there, and they are a cost-effective option because they're already included into the package, that you may get some very strange questions because of the artificial intelligence is not particularly on ball or on task at that stage. If you're actually showing things like films or even doing tours of different exhibitions, you may wish to have an audio describe tour or an audio describer there describing things. Now, audio description, for those who haven't heard, it's the description of the visual elements that occur in a live event. So it can be held in many different live events. If you were showing a film, someone could actually, between the natural dialogue of the film, describe the visuals. So someone who is blind or visually impaired is able to get the full scope of the story, especially if it is very visual, and there are very visual aspects. If you were having a tour, say, of pictures or any different sort of item that can't be touched, again, someone could come along and describe those items in detail. So it actually sets up a visual image in somebody's mind. You can, to an extent, assist in this way yourself. It's not actually as easy as it sounds. We have just trained a group in Sydney who just thought it was going to be really easy and breezy. And then, a little way in, they just realised that it's actually very much a skill set, But you can do little bits yourself. So you may wish to describe yourself and just say that, you know, you'll say, like from myself, I would say that I was about 5'6" tall, blonde with a bob, fairly average looking, and more of a cuddly build, is probably a politer way to say that. So, you know, you might wish to describe yourself like that. You can sort of try and describe your items, but if you know that you're going to have a blind or vision impaired audience, or you wish to attract one, you can let the organisations that service people who are blind or vision impaired know, and they can get it out to their clients that you are going to do this particular tour, and get someone else in to do it. There obviously, like anything, there is a cost to it. The same with Auslan and captioning. There's certainly a cost, and this is where I go back and say to you that, you know, at the beginning, make sure you've got all these items costed out if you want to do them, and that way, you know, you have those items cost. So when you think, oh, after, oh, perhaps I'd like to do this, and then you get the cost and think, you know, I can't do that because it's not in my budget. So it needs to be in your budget to start with. So just trying to think what's the time. Sorry, just checking.
About 2.5 minutes left.
Oh, okay. I've only got 2.5 minutes left.
Well, you can probably go about 5. It's probably all right.
Okay. So with, you know, digital methods, like for some people digital is quite hard. So just to give you an example, for someone who is blind or vision impaired, and I can speak to this quite freely because I have the same issue. When you're looking at something digital, it's silent, it's dead, there is no sound there. So for my purposes, I'm speaking to a room, or Liz, who's here doing my technical stuff, and she's the only one hearing me because there is no ambient sound in the room. So you need to be aware that, you know, people who are blind or vision impaired, whether they're presenting or even when they're listening, they can hear the speaker, but they don't know what else is going on. You guys can go to a gallery view and see everybody there. We can see names, but we actually can't, when I say we can see names, our screen readers can read us the names, but we don't know what people look like, what people are doing. So bear in mind that, you know, this occurs, that some people are not getting the full picture. Again, this is where your artificial intelligence and captioning comes in. There are also facilities, and I do know Zoom has it, that if you are wanting to stream something and someone in a different language needs to have it interpreted, and this also works for your Auslan, is that there is actually a link that you can put on. It's a language setting. So you have an interpreter in so many different languages that can actually interpret. And their sound is at 80%, so the interpretation is at 80%, but they can still actually hear the original speaker, which their sound is at 20%. So there's some different options that can be used for digital. If you're in person, I always say to people, you know, if you're desperate, a pen and paper will do, but try not to rely on this method. When you're, you know, providing some customer service, and this is where your disability awareness comes in, is that, you know, treat people as you feel that you wish to be treated yourself, and ask them what they want or what they would like. One thing we always say is don't ask anyone about their impairment. Some people are quite personal and feel it's a personal issue and can be quite touchy about that. So the best thing is, instead of going, well, I need to know what your disability is so I can help you, reverse that and tell them what facilities you offer or what you're actually offering, instead of saying to them, well, I need to know what your disability is, because in actual fact, if you knew what their disability was, or if you knew what their impairment was, it probably wouldn't help you. So, like if I said to you, I had bilateral meningiomas. Now, unless you're medically inclined, I know that most people know an oma is a cancer, which sounds very dramatic. It's not quite as dramatic as it sounds, but that really doesn't help you to know what how you can help me. So reverse that and just tell them what you offer is the best way to actually do that. I think, in a nutshell, that's pretty much it. Is anyone got questions? Please give me questions. I just love questions.
Thank you, Jody. That's really great. This is Karen again. We have one question from David, who asked when he was registering for this event today. So David asks, can we expect a venue to be aware of access issues when we book the place?
Hi, David. Thanks for your question. That's a great question. One would hope so, but realistically, that's not always the case. If you want to know, your probably best bet is to actually directly ask them if they have accessible features, and perhaps give them examples. Otherwise, people think, oh, we've got an accessible bathroom or we've got a ramp, and that's it. But, their signage and their wayfinding signage may be really inaccessible for someone who's vision impaired or who is a little person because it's so high. So no, unfortunately, you can't expect them to know what their accessibility features are. There are certainly some venues who are really aware of this and are quite open about what they offer and are fantastic. But there are also a lot of venues who have no idea what they actually even offer or if they should be offering it. So the best bet is just to ask them quite directly what they offer or what they do have, or if you want to know if they have particular features, ask them.
Yeah, great, thank you. I'll ask a question that I think is often on a lot of people's minds in our area, which is around history and museums. A lot of people are doing tours or they work out of heritage buildings which can't easily often be modified. So they often see that as a limitation in how much access they can offer. Do you have any suggestions for people in that situation, how they can get around that and still make their events accessible?
Yeah, heritage listed buildings, yes, you're right, are quite different. There are restrictions in place around providing modifications for access. If you're just going to be there for, say, a week, you may just want to put in a temporary solution. So you may want to approach, that for an example, if you needed a ramp because there was only stairs, you may want to approach, your local TAFE who does carpentry and get them as a project to come along and build you a ramp that you can use for a week. It sort of suits everybody. It's a project for them. They can use it in their work. It actually suits people who may be coming to your event. And the other really good thing is that it's going to be supervised by a tutor, so you also know it's going to be safe. So from those kind of things, if you've got a heritage listed building and there may be a bar or a facility, a counter, it's very hard to actually get them to have it lowered. So you might actually want to think of putting a small lower table at the end of the bar, so people who actually need that lower point could perhaps come along to that point, and instead of having to sit there or stand there and raise their hands in the air and hope that you see them. Some other things that occur is sometimes you have there is no actual access at the front of the building, but around the back of the building there is. But it's not very dignified just to send people who have mobility issues to the back. So what we suggest is to be creative around it. So for example, a winery, they had stairs at the front but ramp out the back where the cellar door is. So, you know, you could put, and I know you guys aren't doing winery, but this is just an example to give you some ideas of how you can just be creative with your solutions. So actually perhaps have a grapevine on the wall and say follow the vine to the cellar door, and that way everyone has to go around the back. And you can do creative solutions like that on the way. So that's a way of getting around those sorts of things. And you can do temporary measures. Just don't think that everything you do has to be a permanent solution. There are provisions in the building codes where you can actually put in a temporary solution, particularly with heritage listed buildings. So as long as you're not damaging the building.
Yeah, great, thank you. Just an extension of that question. One scenario that often comes up is that there's a second floor to the building and the only access is by stairs. If somebody was to provide, say, a video approximation of the experience of the upstairs section of your exhibition or museum or whatever it is that enough, or is that you know, that doesn't give you the same experience?
No, look, it doesn't give you the same experience, but what it does is it provides some inclusion to what you actually have on, say, that second floor. So you may wish to put main features on the first floor and put other features and have, you know, as you said, a video link or something to, or a video of what is actually on the second floor. So it allows people to be included in that second floor, opposed to wondering, like leaving the building, wondering what on earth is on that second floor. So, you know, you can do it that way. Like I can give you an example, the Adelaide Festival, most people would have heard of the Palais. They actually had an internal staircase to the roof. All they had up there was a bar, but downstairs they also had a bar, and they programmed all their events for downstairs. So it didn't matter if you couldn't get upstairs, you didn't miss out on any of the actual features of what was going on. So that's, you know, obviously another way around it. But yes, I think the idea of a video of what is happening is also a really good solution.
Yeah, no, that's great, thank you. And I think sometimes we just have to get a bit creative, like you said, think about how we can do things differently.
Look, thinking outside, you just think outside the box, you know, be creative, allow yourself to be creative. And just because you're making it different, it doesn't mean that you're actually making it highlighted that, oh, it has to be different because of disabled people. It just means that, you know, it could just mean that you're a creative person, you want to be creative, you want to do something that's a little different. And it just so happens that it works for everybody.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think that leads me on to my next question, which is around audio description. And I think just while you were talking earlier, I think some of the inclusive elements that you can add to your events actually can enhance the experience for everybody. So I remember bumping into an audio description tour at the art gallery once, and I kind of lurked around behind them listening in because I thought it was such a great way of looking really closely at the paintings and kind of bringing out different elements of the paintings. And I think things like tactile elements as well are the same thing. Often we just rely on the sight and the sound in our events, and we kind of neglect the rest. So I think sometimes you can enhance rather than kind of just filling in the gaps, if you know what I mean. Yeah.
I mean, look, we've had lots of comments, and when we've done tours, we have had lots of people do what you do. They sort of lurk around and sort of listen, because what the describers are trained to do is to make sure that they're hitting all the key features to make to give you the information so you can build the story and visualization in your mind. So they're actually seeing things that if you went and looked at yourself, probably wouldn't see. And we have a really classic example of the Migration Museum. We did a tour there once, which was absolutely fabulous. But we only saw a painting into one of the rooms, and the describer actually highlighted two little children that happened to be in the corner of this painting. And two of the tour guides were with us and said that they'd been there 20 years and never even noticed it. So yeah, so for description, it can add that other element to it, that it doesn't just assist people who are blind or vision impaired. It can actually highlight it for a number of disabilities, and just generally speaking, people. Around your touch items, they've had tactile exhibitions in different museums, and they've actually found that everyone loves to touch something. It doesn't matter who you are or what you're doing, everyone loves to touch something.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have, say, a tactile item, if it's able to be touched, that's great. If for some reason, you know, particularly historically, if it's delicate, you may choose to do something like, if you're a bit crafty, you could make a replica of it that people can touch. Otherwise, you can get other elements. So maybe a type of stone, a smooth stone, would give the feel of maybe the base of what it's sitting on, or even what it's carved out of. So you can, you know, be creative in those sorts of ways as well. So, you know, everyone can be really involved, and that actually includes everybody, because you know, everyone always, I just find that really amazing how much people, generally speaking, love to touch things.
Absolutely. Try and keep people's fingers off, you know,
Yeah.
fabrics and things.
When it says do not touch, it's, you know, it's usually the bit that someone wants to touch.
Absolutely. I was going to ask about audio description. Obviously, there are some people out there who, as you said, you can book their services to do that. But is there any training if people are really, really interested in learning how to become audio describers? Is there training in SA that people can do?
Yes. Yeah, there is. And I say that sort of in a funny way, is because of COVID, we're actually in the process of moving our training to an online platform. If we had enough people here in SA, you need a certain amount of people to train before it becomes a viable option to run a training session. But we are moving it on to to a digital platform. We have actually just run a trial. We've still got one element of that trial left to go, and it looks reasonably promising. So it is possible. Access to Arts is the only one who does train here in South Australia with audio description, and we actually do train people around the country, and we've trained people in Singapore as well. And you may hear, you know, different services around the country, and you need to be aware that some people offer a voluntary service and some people call themselves a professional service. The difference between the two is that a voluntary service is just that, it is voluntary. The training is really, really minimal, and the service can be very ad hoc. Whereas if you have a professional describer, firstly, you do need to pay for their services, but you can pretty much guarantee that if they're being trained by someone who's recognisable, their skills are really good. And they've had, you know, comprehensive training in what they're doing.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about what Access to Arts does, what kind of things your team is up to, just to give people a little bit more of an idea about the
Okay,
organisation.
it's a little hard at the moment. We're actually going through a process of change. Our last business director has left and we have a new CEO who is putting some changes into effect. But essentially, what we do is we support disabled artists to access grants and assist them to write them. We also support them and introduce them and give them direction to mentors that may be able to assist them with their art. On the other side, we assist people to gain access in the arts. So, you know, we provide audio description for, we do it for more than just the arts, but particularly the arts. We engage Auslan interpreters and captioners as well. And every now and again, we run a program where we provide assistance for people who want to experience the arts, but don't want to necessarily do it on their own or a little unsure about it. And we run different types of workshops from time to time.
Wonderful, thank you. That's about all of our time today. I was going to ask, I'm not sure if I'm putting you on the spot here, Jody, but what's the top takeaway you'd like people to take away from this workshop today?
I think, firstly, don't panic when you're thinking about access and inclusion. You know, stay reasonable about it. Just think that they are people with just additional requirements. And one thing you can do, which I didn't sort of hugely touch on, is write yourself a checklist. If you're not sure what you want to pop or you should be doing, write yourself a checklist. Check it over with your friends or a professional body. But ultimately, remember, people are people. And if you see that before the disability, you'll be fine.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a really great note to finish on. So thank you so much again, Jody, for joining us today. That was really great. And yeah, and we'll share the recording of this session for anybody if you want to share it with your colleagues, and some additional resources if anything comes out of this that we can share with you. Our next webinar is in 2 weeks on the 18th of November. So that one's about running events in a new COVID environment, thinking ahead to next year. And that's with the History Trust, Work Health and Safety Manager, Amber, and we'd love you to come along with that. We'll give you the sign-up details on Eventbrite. And make sure you head to the History Festival website for all of our additional resources. You can download lots of different things there to help you plan your events for next year. And as I said earlier, we'll be sending around information about registering for next year's History Festival very soon. Thanks again, Liz and Britt, for your help behind the scenes. And thank you once again, Jody, and everyone for coming along today. And we'll see you again soon.